In 1910, the British writer and poet Rudyard Kipling published a collection of his works in an unspectacular volume called Rewards and Fairies. And tucked away within that publication was a short poem which Kipling had simply entitled F. A little collection of thoughts which Kipling had pulled together as advice for his then 13-year-old son John. But this little work, brimming with Kipling's distinctive rhythmic, almost musical bounce, and his use of simple, accessible language, would find powerful resonance in his readers. For his advice has proven to be timeless, and its lines easy to extract and invitingly quotable. And while the poem did prove to be popular in its own time, Kipling himself would probably be very surprised to find out just how prevalent this poem remains over a century after its publication, with its wise words adorning the walls of offices and classrooms and living rooms right across the globe. Indeed, few poems are quoted as frequently as this one, its lines gracing movie classics as diverse as the epic Vietnam flick Apocalypse Now, right through to Bridget Jones's Diary. And the last thing that players see as they walk out to Centre Court Wimbledon is an excerpt from this poem imploring good sportsmanship. If you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same. Indeed, If was voted by a BBC poll in 1995 as Britain's most popular poem. An extraordinary achievement, considering Kipling's competition: Shakespeare, Wilde, Wordsworth, Keats, Milton, Burns, Charlotte Bronte, Dylan Thomas, T.S. Eliot, Wilfred Owen. And so, considering the global gravitas of this poem, you may be surprised to learn of its unlikely South African origins. Because Kipling was of course British, and what time he did spend in the colonies was primarily spent in his country of birth, India, the land which had of course inspired his renowned work, The Jungle Book. But from 1898, as a relatively established writer in his mid-30s, Kipling began to spend his dreary British winters in the warmth of Cape Town, with its long balmy days and famously relaxed way of life. Although at that time, simmering beneath this tranquility was a deep political tension. A tension which had burst onto the front pages of newspapers following a notorious incident in 1895, 3 years before Kipling's arrival in Cape Town. An incident which had polarized the region and sent it spiraling towards what would become known as the Anglo-Boer War. And it was this incident, remembered today as the Jameson Raid, which inspired Kipling's poem F. For this was another one of those complex episodes in the South African story which has a knack of bringing out both the best and the worst of our human character, and where context is critical to understanding its intricacies. Because almost a decade before the raid in 1886, a gold reef of unimaginable scale had been unearthed on a barren farm 30 miles south of Pretoria, the capital of the independent Boer Republic of the Transvaal. And this discovery had, overnight, converted Paul Kruger's near-bankrupt republic into one of the wealthiest states per capita on planet Earth. And in time, Cecil John Rhodes, the man who was leading Britain's expansion in the region, had come to realize just how critical it was to the continued prominence of the Greater British Empire that the gold coming out of the ground in the Transvaal was siphoned back to the vaults of London rather than to an increasingly inquisitive Germany. So, Rhodes, whose increasingly intense diplomatic pressure on the defiant Paul Kruger was as yet proving fruitless, now resorted to a more immediate plan of grabbing control of the Transvaal by force. And his audacious plan was to provoke an uprising amongst the foreign population working the mines in Johannesburg, and then to combine that uprising with a simultaneous invasion of the Transvaal by a band of mercenaries led by his old friend Leander Starr Jameson. And importantly, this plan secured the approval of the British Colonial Secretary at the time, Joseph Chamberlain, and through him effectively Queen Victoria herself. But as is the case with mercenary forces, this could never take the form of a formal approval, for Britain could not, of course, be seen to be invading sovereign states without a formal mandate and declaration of war. And so, as a state, they would of course distance themselves from the plan should it all go wrong. And that is exactly what happened. Because a series of communication errors and missed telegrams meant that the execution of Rhodes's plan was disjointed and indecisive, with Jameson's force of mercenaries who had entered the Transvaal on December the 29th, easily rounded up by Paul Kruger's commandos under the leadership of Piet Cronje within just 3 days. And predictably, the whole debacle was reported on by the global press as a great scandal. A fiasco with the potential to cause great embarrassment to the British Empire. However, Rhodes and the British, of course, immediately denied any knowledge of the invasion. And so blame, by process of elimination, landed squarely on the plate of Jameson and the other foot soldiers involved in the invasion itself. Now the Transvaal Republic had every right to have these men hanged for treason. But President Kruger, a formidable diplomat despite his limited formal education, instead shrewdly handed the men back to the British to be punished by their own. A move which effectively forced the British, in denying their involvement in the raid, to acknowledge the sovereign right of the Transvaal, which was at the time being undermined by Rhodes. And the result was a very curious scenario, for the British were now forced to punish Jameson and the other leaders of the invasion for a deed which they themselves had of course secretly supported. And their solution was to sentence Jameson to 15 months in prison for his efforts, an act which initially went some way to saving British face. But, in a not unfamiliar sounding twist to us South Africans, Jameson was then released just 1 month into his sentence on, believe it or not, medical parole. And South Africans will also not be surprised to hear that Jameson made a miraculous medical recovery. So much so that he was soon back in balmy Cape Town and eyeing out what would be remembered as one of the all-time great political comebacks. Indeed, by 1903, a year after peace had been secured in the Anglo-Boer War, and 8 years after the ill-fated invasion, Jameson had, despite his famous setback, managed to rebuild his political career, and was now elected to lead one of the Cape's major political parties, the Progressive Party, a party which would in turn go on to win the 1904 elections, so propelling the once disgraced Jameson into the unlikely position of Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. And it was this famous comeback, Jameson's indomitable spirit, which had inspired Kipling to write the poem If. And if one looks carefully through the poem's famous lines, one can find clear reference to the levers of this infamous chapter. Firstly, in the poem's memorable opening line, Kipling observes how blame for the incident had been disproportionately allocated to Jameson. If you can keep your head, when all about you are losing theirs, and blaming it on you. And then, in celebrating the classic British stiff upper lip, Kipling toasts Jameson's quiet acceptance of this blame without dragging his beloved empire into the scandal. And then, having accepted blame, Kipling applauded Jameson's resilience, how he had picked himself up and resurrected his seemingly ruined political career. Consider the third verse. If you can make a heap of all your winnings and risk it at one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again from your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. And finally, with his closing lines, Kipling converted the learnings from Jameson into actionable advice for his son John, who was, as a 13-year-old, of course, just being primed for manhood. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you will be a man, my son. Tragically, John would have little time to heed this advice, because just a month after his 18th birthday, he, like so many others, was killed in action during World War I. And what was believed to be his body would only be recovered in 1992, with final clarity as to his gravesite concluded only in January 2016, over 100 years after his death. Rudyard Kipling would never really recover from this loss. But his paternal advice, inspired by that long-forgotten and ill-advised raid into the Transvaal veldt, has now inspired generations of people around the world for over a century. Here is a shortened version of this famous poem, and as I read it, listen for the indomitable spirit of Leander Starr Jameson leaping from its verse. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can dream and not make dreams your master. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can make one heap of all your winnings, and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again from your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth, and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son.